Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. And for this one, I'm going to be discussing the anion gap. What is it? When do we use it? What's like the whole purpose of it? And hopefully after this video, if you ever get asked about the anion gap, you will have a good idea or good explanation for when to use it, why it's important, etc., etc. So let's get into the anion gap. So the first thing we need to know with the anion gap is how do you calculate it and what is it exactly? And this you definitely will need to know for rounds or really for internal medicine. You'll just need to know this, really for anything actually. This is how you calculate the anion gap. So it's going to be your sodium minus chloride plus your bicarb. So to calculate an anion gap, you're going to take your total sodium that the patient has, and then you are going to subtract the sum of chloride and bicarb. The next question would be, okay, like what is a normal anion gap? Normal is going to be between 8 to 12. So for example, if a patient was acidotic and you calculated their anion gap, if it was greater than 12, then you would say they had a anion gap metabolic acidosis. So the next question is, okay, so when exactly would I need to use the anion gap? So this comes into play if a patient has a metabolic acidosis. So not for a respiratory alkalosis, not for a metabolic alkalosis. You use this in a metabolic acidosis. And the reason is because the anion gap can help differentiate why exactly a patient is acidotic. And the important thing to remember about an anion gap and a metabolic acidosis is that it is going to tell you, is this patient acidotic because they have too much of an acid, or have they just lost bicarb? And if they have gained acid, it will be high. If it's more because they've lost bicarb, then generally the anion gap will be normal. So before we move any further, let's just quickly break down what would be the lab values on an ABG for a patient who was acidotic and it was metabolic. So obviously the first thing, if you want to remember, your pH is going to be less than 7.35, right? Because the pH is the first thing we're going to look at to determine alkalotic or acidotic, and in this case, less than 7.35. And then the next component we're going to look at is the PaCO2. Now for a metabolic acidosis, the PaCO2 generally will be normal. And that intuitively makes sense, right? Because if the PaCO2 was elevated, right, because CO2 equals acid, the PaCO2 was elevated, then it would likely be a respiratory acidosis, not metabolic. And then the final component of this is you want to look at your bicarb, and then your bicarb will be low, and by low, that specifically means less than 22. All right, and then the last component of this talk, I just wanted to discuss what are some of the causes of a high anion gap metabolic acidosis. And this is prime pint material, and there's different mnemonics to remember this. There's mud piles, and then there's Goldmark. I use Goldmark just because during a nephrology rotation, my preceptor was really big on remembering Goldmark. So let's go ahead and get into it. So with Goldmark, you can remember the causes of a metabolic acidosis with a high anion gap, or high anion gap metabolic acidosis. So let's go ahead and discuss this a little bit more. So G is going to be glycol, so ethylene glycol and propylene glycol. Next is going to be oxoproline. From what I could read, this sounds like it'll be pretty rare, but the instances you could see it would be if a patient was taking acetaminophen, and then another one was glutathione synthetase deficiency, so an enzyme deficiency. So next is going to be L for L-lactate. Now L-lactate and D-lactate, I'll get into explaining the difference there, but essentially when a lactate is drawn or someone says, hey, draw a lactate, that generally refers to L-lactate. So you'll see that in a patient generally who's like septic or they have a nidus of infection. Now D-lactate is a little bit different. It's something that could be elevated in a condition called short bowel syndrome. Essentially, that's when there's not enough of the small bowel to properly digest foods that are eaten. Now just moving forward, we have methanol, and then after methanol, next is aspirin, so salicylate toxicity. And then R, that's going to be renal failure, and then K is going to be ketoacidosis. So with Goldmark, you should be able to remember the common causes of a high anion gap metabolic acidosis. All right, well, again, I hope that was helpful. Like, comment, subscribe, let me know what you'd want in the next video. Hope this was helpful. See you all next time.